Wow. Hey, much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. Thanks for tuning in once again. Today, we're going to go ahead and read from this book. It's called The Lost History of the Little People, Their Spiritually Advanced Civilizations Around the World by Susan B. Martinez, PhD. Yeah, so we're going to get into this great book right here. It actually has a lot of history from all over the world. We're going to focus on the Americas today. But you guys let me know in the comment section if you want me to read the whole book chapter by chapter. All right. But yeah, very interesting information. We've already gone over some articles and archaeological digs where they found little bones here in the Americas, mass graves of little people, very small stature people in the Americas. So we're going to go ahead and focus on that today. Again, if you want me to read the whole book, just let me know in the comment section. So again, we're going to belly flop to chapter 2 of this book. In chapter 2, it starts talking about the history of little people in the Americas. As it says here, the little people of tribal North America. And now, tribal North America, brimming with memories of a tiny race of human beings, which the student might reasonably pair with extensive pygmy cemeteries in the United States. All right, he's saying there's actually a lot of confirmed archaeological digs that are talking about this. As you guys can see, the footnote is an ancient man by Corliss. You saw the source. Admittedly, my own survey only skims the surface, for as things indicate, a thoroughly researched study of North America's indigenous little people, at least in folklore, could fill a volume in its own right. You know, just in the Americas, right? The folklore of little people. Let's begin in the East. Archaeologists did not hesitate to call Southwest Pennsylvania's small burial vaults one of the most baffling riddles in Pennsylvania history. And you can find that in the writing Tumuli in southwestern Pennsylvania by Carpenter. However, America's early settlers, plain folk, were not so very baffled, simply concluding that they were the remains of a race of dwarfs. But how long ago? One of the earliest dates for people in North America, 18,000 before the present, comes from Pennsylvania itself. You guys hear that? 18,000 before the present. The Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in the western part of the state. Author and archaeologist Jeffrey Goodman announced in 1981 that material recovered from that site could be as old as 20,000 years old. All right. And that's from Prehistoric Man by Adams. Okay. The item in question was the fragment of a basket. Goodman's date is in line with Harold Gladwin's Pygmy groups in the Americas, dating to as long ago as 25,000 years before or BC, right? BC, and Texas and Southwest. All right, Pygmy groups, listen. So Pygmies did not just originate in Africa, all right? Wake up. These, the earliest people in Southwest, were also basket makers. They were short and slender, and that's from a book called Men Out of Asia by Gladwin. Stone lined and filled with shell beads and copper ornaments, these extensive grave mounds, tumuli, found in Pennsylvania are on par with Ohio and Tennessee burials, the latter no doubt accommodating the Nunnehi or Jungwi Tsunsti people of Cherokee fame. The Nunnehi, as memory faded to myth, became a race of spirit beings, the immortals, and shape changers who go about invisibly. But even Indian sources say one can hardly tell the difference between them and the mortal little people, the Yungwi, the Sunsti, who, according to the Cherokee, were the size of a child, reaching to a man's knee. Are they then the occupants of those tiny graves? At Coffee County, Tennessee, A pygmy burial ground of 6 acres covers the remains of thousands of door-like people. We've actually read the newspaper articles, the original, when they found these things. Shout out to the archivist. We read his findings. I got a whole series on the old newspaper articles that we've read, and that was one of the articles we actually read. Listen again, 6 acres of burial grounds of so-called dwarf-like people or pygmies or little people. Also at Cochocton, Ohio, burials have been uncovered of a pygmy race, only about 3 feet tall. Likewise, at Mammoth Cave in Kentucky, were 3 feet tall mummies with red hair found in 1920. All right, red hair doesn't mean pale skin. It's not does not always mean pale skin. Either way, it probably had both melanated and pale skin red hair giants or little people. Little people, in fact, are known to many of the southeastern tribes, such as the Muskogee, the women remarkably short of stature, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole, the latter claiming that the little people, who can't really be seen, live in the holes of big trees. Perhaps if you squint your eyes a bit, you'll see them running all around the twisted wood. Nevertheless, when you get very sick, they will appear at your bedside, but then only the sick can see them. A long time ago, say the Choctaw, while their people were living in Mississippi, certain small beings, sometimes called spirit beings, lived nearby, known as the Kowi Anukasha or forest dwellers. They were between 2 and 3 feet tall, the size of a bitty child. All right. Again, he has sources for all the stuff he's saying here, or she, sorry. As for the northern tribes, the Iroquois, Seneca, and Tuscarora, little ones called Geolut Moses egg are still occasionally spotted, healers and tricksters. These great little people are honored in the ritual called the Dark Dance. This ceremony, very ancient, is based on a pact of friendship the Indians made with them long ago. The Passamaquoddy from Maine, right? This is an Indian indigenous group, say that the little ones were here before Glooskap, and sure enough, they became a so-called fairy race, the Nagum Wasuk, who help out the Indians invisibly. To the Micmac, they are the Hukalu Tumush, identified as the creators of the petroglyphs. The Ojibwa call their own little people May May Way Siwuk. They may occasionally be seen paddling their stone canoes. Out west, the Tewa Pueblos call them Towae, literally little people. Towavar, Tua. In Carlsbad Caverns, New Mexico, there are mummified remains of little people examined in 1950 by author Coral E. Lawrenson, The Shadow of the Unknown. Among the Oklahoma Indians, there are two kinds of little people. Finally, graves of diminutive race of men are also reported near St. Louis. The Stick Indians, Steyehama, not such a pleasant bunch, are said to live out of sight, high in the hills of the Cascade Mountains. They are greatly feared, like the Icos of Mexico, Cesalt, or Celtal, sorry, and the Wendes of British Honduras. Curiously, another high hill, this one in Sioux Country, carries a similar sinister reputation. Mentioned in the Journal of William Clark, of Lewis and Clark fame, on August 24th, 1804, a high hill was reached in an immense plain. It was said to be the residence of devils, about 18 inches high. Remarkably, large-headed, these little stick Indians are armed with sharp arrows and do not hesitate to kill anyone who tries to approach their hill. So much do the Maha, Sioux, Otos, and other neighboring nations believe this, that no consideration is sufficient to induce them to approach the hill, wrote Clark in his journal. All right? He literally wrote that, guys. However, On the following day, August 25th, President Jefferson's acclaimed corpse of discovery reached the Tenton River in Kansas. There, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark happened to camp at another hill, which was actually a mound, man made. Here, the bold explorers recorded an interesting bit of information about this earthwork. The Dakota Indians called it Mountain of the Little People, or Spirit Mound. Later, Professor Ella E. Clark, in her book Indian Legends of the Northern Rockies, related one man's account concerning the enigmatic Crow medicine wheel. It is difficult to believe, but our forefathers claimed the little people lived there. The elders say they were a small people, like 8 years old, living in the rocks near the Yellowstone. Oral tradition has the Arapaho and Cheyenne describing a type of stick Indian who stood from just 20 inches to 3 feet high, called the tiny people eaters. In Wyoming, the Pedro Mountain Mummy answers to local Shoshone stories of the Nimerigar, a race of minuscule folk who attacked them with tiny bows and poison arrows. As we've seen, the Shoshone vocabulary includes a word whose root is nana and is translated by the compilers of the Shoshone dictionary as elf-like people. So again, I'm clicking on the footnote so you guys can see in the bottom footnote, that's from Mysteries by Wilkins, page 138. So he has, sources for everything here, or she, sorry. Up in the British Columbia, the Haida Nation recalls the first people coming out of the clamshells, possibly dug out of arks, and there were 5 little bodies. The Nisqually of Washington tell a story of 3 brothers captured by a miraculously strong dwarf whose village to which they were carried was inhabited by a race of people as small as their captor. As their council sat to decide the brothers' fate, an immense flock of birds, resembling geese, pounced upon them and attacked them violently. Stories of huge attacked birds are not unusual in tribal America. As one Cherokee tale, for example, has a band of little people, the Tusundi Gewi, assaulted by a flock of sandhill cranes, killing them all to extinction. What fascinates us is that the same story is told of India's little people, beset by cranes. Every year they go down to the sea and eat the cranes' eggs, hoping to protect themselves against the rampaging flocks. In Africa, too, Homer in the Iliad described a race of tiny folk. Whither the cranes fly when inclement winters and piercing frosts visit the northern shores, bearing slaughter to the pygmy men. All right? You see this? It's all the same. They're hunting the same bird, doing the same thing that the stories in the Americas are saying about their little people. Fierce battles between the pygmies, armed with lances and cranes, were mentioned by later writers such as Pliny the Elder, first century, who said that Hatisi dwarfs were driven away by cranes. Such scenes were later depicted on Greek vases, which made them appear as dwarfish looking men with large heads, although the pygmies in reality conform in their relative proportions, not to dwarfs, but to full sized people of other races. They are therefore strikingly unlike the stumpy, short limbed pygmies so graphically represented on ancient Greek vases, all right? They have their body is proportionate. They're not like what they're describing, in the Greek vases. Reaching northernmost America, we get one last look at little people in the 10th century when the Scandinavian Viking reached northeastern America near Rhode Island. They found their race totally distinct from the red man and more approaching the Eskimo, whom they designated Skrillinger or chips. So small and misshapen were they. It was the same race as in Labrador, whom they contemporarily call Skralinger and describe as numerous and short of stature. All right, so even the so-called Scandinavian Vikings, they might be seeing that trip in reverse. Vikings might have came out of here before they went over there, right? And then if they're coming back for trade, coming back to one of their ancient lands. Says here Mexico. Mexico's richly storied past brings with little people. Many of Quetzalcoatl's attendants were dwarfs. Now remember, we've shown the Maya vases, the rolled out photographs, where showing a lot of so-called dwarfs or little people next to, taller people. Stone dwarfs hold up the altar table in the shrine of the Temple of Morning Star at Tula. The Olmecs were inordinately fond of creating clay statuettes of dwarf gods called chaneques, dangerous rain deities living in the forest, and we've seen attending waterfalls. At La Venta, an Olmec site, a statue in one of the altar's niches holds a dwarf on its lap. So, like similar reliefs at Monte Alban, where tiny entryways to the chambers, as well as pygmy tunnels, have been noted. Everything about the stone remains at Niscute is dwarfed. The rooms are small, the ceilings low. In Yucatan, dwarves were sacred to the sun god. Tiny huts, long deserted, were photographed by Florida based explorer Rolf Schell in the late 1950s along the Yucatan coast, published in his privately printed book, A Yank in Yucatan. I'm going to try to look for that. At Consumel, there is a little temple whose doorway measures 3 feet in height. Indeed, all along this coast are little houses and temples answering to local lore of pygmies who once lived there. Ancient petroglyphs depicting tiny persons have been found throughout Yucatan, Belize, and Guatemala. Beneath Oaxaca, at the old Zapotec capital, mysterious tunnels are far too small to be used by adults, being about 20 inches high. Mexican iconography, of course, is loaded with super squat gods and demigods. In fact, a living representative was seen as recently as 1977 at one of the ruins, clothed in all typical Mayan tunic. The huipil, a caretaker at Mayapan, once the capital of the Maya, now in ruins, was the witness. The little intruder was about 4 feet tall, with a long jet black beard and a machete slung over his shoulder, known as an or as alux. These little men had been described to the first conquistadores, and while their tiny stone huts were long known among natives as alux houses, archaeologists officially dubbed them votary shrines, with no further information on their origin. Let archaeologists write them off as votary shrines, but present day Mayas say they were the homes of favored alux. To this day, these structures with short doorways can be seen in front of the main temple at many Mayan ruins. All right, and here's, I guess, a description of some, as you guys can see. And I've actually shown the actual rock and the features on these people, right? Look at the features. They have like afros and have thick lips, flat noses, like big wide. I've shown these guys in other videos, the original rocks. It says Olmec dancers, that's what we were looking at, danzantes at Monte Alban, carved in relief on building look like typical negritos, like I just said. I ain't making this up. Mayan temples are also covered with bas reliefs and carvings of naked little men. This brings us to the acclaimed Mayan temple of dwarfs at Uxmal in the Yucatan, with such small doors and chambers that they seem to have been designed for the use of pygmies, far too small for the normal human occupants. Also known as Temple of the Magicians, a near copy was discovered in the outlying islands in 1968 when explorers found 3 foot thick limestones walls underwater at Andros Island in the Bahamas. Among these ruins was recognized the same exact floor plan of the Mayan temple at Uxmal. All right, you guys hear that? They found that in the Bahamas. Mayan dwarfs of the first world called Seyam Unicop are said to have built these ancient cities, but their world was destroyed in the first great flood. It was, I believe, the flood, the submersion actually of an island continent to the west, Pan, the temple at Uxman, as far as James Churchward and Augustus Le Plongeon could determine, was a memorial commemorating the loss of the lands of the West, of this land and the 3 foot tall people who survived the submersion. We will be hearing much more in the chapters to come. So, when it comes to James Churchward, the guy who invented, that Lemuria thing, we found out that he actually got all his investigation from the archaeological finds of William Niven and Mexico. So he made up all that other stuff. And Auguste Le Plongeon, he's always giving credit to the Americas. So I don't know what they're talking about here. To the Americas. We've read his book, Queen Mu. So here's a drawing of one of these little people. I don't know where they're getting that from. It says that was Alux. Nearly all Yucatan's thousands of Mayan ruins have tiny stone houses with doorways less than 3 feet high. Then they got this other drawing right here. And that's Mexican deity from Vienna Codex and Peru image, almost the same. Why are so many Guatemalan deities or Guatemalan deities pictured as dwarfs? The answer, I think, has to do with the modest height of the great ancestor. The great explorer Alexander von Humboldt learned of a race of pygmies in Mexico's unexplored region of Chiapas, near the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. Later, a professor returning from this region spoke of many colonies of undersized people, having measured two such individuals at 3 feet 6 inches. Though they are getting taller, these were no doubt ancestors of the Lacandon, the little men near Lake Pelja, and the mahogany forest. By the time Count Byron the Prorock visited them in the 1930s, they measured 4.5 feet, though some much shorter. There in the jungle between Chiapas and Guatemala, they grow corn, cotton, and tobacco. I highly recommend the online video of the Lacandon. It can be found at, and then YouTube. And literally, guys, when I click on that, it just brings me to YouTube. It doesn't really bring me to a specific video. So there's a picture of the Lacandon. I have other pictures of them, very swarthy, with dreadlocks and everything, but with long hair, wavy hair, just like this. And they did dress in these white tunic robes, in general, and they still kind of do. The ones that are going by that name today. Says here, everyone knows that the indigenous people of Guatemala are very short. In fact, some of the villages around the shore of Lake Atitlan, remember, you add the TIS, the Greek suffix, what do you get? Atitlantis, Atitlantis, Atlantis, are occupied by Indians, small enough to be called pygmies. At Petén near Nacum and Tikal, Topoxte has been described as miniature city or a miniature city, right? Topoxte, with everything built to a small scale, temples, pyramids, staircases. And you guys can Google Topoxte ruins and see what it looks like. Continue says, in the jungle, too, there have been many rumors of pygmy-like beings, extending to the hardwood jungles of British Honduras, where two little people were sighted by a government timberman in 1944. The woodsman described the pair as about 3 feet tall, the man heavily bearded, and the woman with extremely long hair, matching James Churchward's account. When I was in British Honduras, I was informed that hunters and explorers occasionally met them back in the dark valleys of the mountains. They are about 3 feet tall, with an abundance of very long black hair. All right. So it's funny because, you watch the movies like Lord of the Rings and stuff, and you see the dwarves, they are hairy, and a lot of them with long beards, and long hair. Here's an image. Supposedly it says here, bearded and squat figure, carved from volcanic stone, Franchinque, Guatemala, drawn by Jose Bouvier. About a century ago, investigators and observers were reporting that many natives of America's tropics are almost dwarfs. Women average a little over 4 feet. Writer Bill Mack declared this indigenous type ensconced everywhere from the Yucatan to Tierra del Fuego. The tropical rainforests of Central and South America are inhabited by a race of dwarf-like people. In parts of Central and South America, they were called Sisemite or Toyo, and the villages gave them special local names. Continuing says here South America. Extend from Panama to Argentina to the southernmost tip of the continent are little known remnants of a race of little people. From the Bogena of Panama to the Jagan at Tierra del Fuego, many of the latter only 4 feet 7 inches tall, living in the western part of Cape Horn. Fuegan women in the 19th century measured only a few inches above 4 feet. Chile's Alacaluf people are also short-statured and thought to be among the earliest South Americans pushed ever southward by latter people. At San Blas and the islands east of Panama are the Tupi Tahuales, a pin-sized folk regarded as extremely intelligent. Sedate and agricultural, their lifeways echo those of other little people we will encounter in the pages to come, hinting at the common ancestry, the original unity that has so long eluded students of the past. These San Blas folk, we learn from A. H. Verrill's first-hand observations, 1927, are industrious, peaceful, cleanly. The gentler sex here are the most emancipated of emancipated women. To R.O. March, who also stayed with them in the 1920s, they were dignified, friendly, hospitable, and cheerful. They were intelligent and quick-witted, skillful seamen, and artistic hand workers. Their social organization was highly developed and stable. Their culture kept unchanged from time immemorial. Like the artisans we will glimpse in chapter 3 and again in chapter 4, they are adept woodcarvers and weavers of splendid cotton, the Kuna group. Most fascinating and reminding us at once of the North American pueblos. These little people of San Blas are in the habit of clustering their dwellings, their houses found densely packed together. The Acurias, in this region and unknown to the outer world until visited by Verrill in the early 1920s, are described as rather like little Caucasians. The women about 4 feet tall, their eyes are straight, noses thin, and well-bridged chins well developed, foreheads broad. Then too in the villages of Loja Province, Colombia, one comes across stunted Indians. I myself have met some unforgettable little rosy-cheeked Colombians while touring the Andes many years ago, and had it not been for a recent news story, we would never have heard of another group of little white-skinned people tucked away in the mountains of Ecuador or light-skinned people. In a remote corner of this equatorial nation live the Laron dwarfs, incorrectly labeled dwarfs for they are simply little people, well proportioned, though rather stout. Laron syndrome is the scientific name for the genetic differences in these people, who are also found in the Bahamas, Turkey, and Israel. Standing about 4 feet high, these gentle folk show no occurrence of cancer or diabetes. They are long lived. It seems they lack a hormone, LG or 1G, F1, that other humans possess. Numbering no more than 300 souls, these Andean Laron cases are currently under study as their hormone pattern seems to be the reason for their health and longevity. The dwarf-like Mashiguenga people in the Peruvian jungle are significantly the guardians of the Chacha ruins, another Peruvian tribe measuring only 39 inches tall. was reported in a 1970 book published by the Roman Catholic Vicariate living along the banks of the Curanha River, where Brazil, Peru, and Bolivia meet. These people are called Yuxé. In Brazil itself, little people noted by earlier Jesuit missionaries and seen sporadically in the Amazon rainforest have been variously labeled leprechauns, pygmies, and dwarfs. Brazil, in fact, is home to scattered Negrito tribes. All right, listen. Colonel P.H. Fawcett having described such group in their interior as short, dark, and hairy pit dwellers. And again, we've read his books, Mysteries of South America, right? And the Ancient Cities of South America, two different books by Colonel Fawcett we actually have read, still reading. Very good book. Check out the previous videos, catch up. What Fawcett was really looking for was an ancient civilization thought to be hidden somewhere in Mato Grosso, its inhabitants dwelling in stone palaces and cultivating the arts of high antiquity. The region was full of such legends. The Brazilian remains, which I have seen, wrote Fawcett, show a civilization with which nothing in any of the Americas can compare. They antedate anything previously known. Their script astonishingly ancient. All right? Talking about the true old world. In fact, the living tapuyas in eastern Brazil seem to be refugees of that civilization. Fair as the English with white, golden, and auburn hair. Gosh, the hijack. Not all tapuyas look like that. See, this is what I'm saying, how they add their biases here. And of course, those parts don't have sources. And they're talking about modern people too. From whence came this fair race? That is the intriguing question we will address and answer in chapter 5. I just want to make an example here. He said that the tapuyas were fair skinned with blonde hair, right? You got to dodge the hijack. That's tapuyas right there. All right. That's a tapuya man right here. Let me show you. Okay. That's a tapuya. Does he look blonde and fair skinned? This is why I tell you, you got to dodge the hijack with some of these uh, old world researchers, right? Here's another tapuya drawing. What does it say here? Na redinha tapuyas, right? Tapuyas. Do you guys see that? Tapuyas, melanated folks. What do you mean? Fair skinned with blonde hair. Dodge the hijack. But for now, let us move on to chapter 3 and a closer look at the highly civilized little people who inhabited Arabia 8,000 years ago. All right, so that's a whole other section. Again, today we were focusing on the Americas. Again, let me know if you want me to read the full book chapter by chapter in the comments. What we're going to do now is a little bonus. We're going to get it like it's the first time. We're going to go over some research we've done before regarding all these mass graves and burials of little people in North America. The natural and aboriginal history of Tennessee up to the first settlements therein by the white people in the year 1768. And this is from 1823. So now we're going to go into section 2. This is going to get interesting as well. It says here, of their pygmies. Okay, so not only did we have giants, but they're finding pygmies here buried in Tennessee. We've gone over a newspaper article. I'm going to show you guys already before. So this is just more corroboration here. It says here, certain small tombs and skeletons in them having been discovered a few miles from Sparta in the county of White, and a publication having been made concerning them in the Nashville Whig of June 1820. Mr. Lane, from whom the information first came, was written to. All his feelings were alive, and all his exertions were roused. The result was a communication, some time afterwards, from him carefully reduced to writing, which with the materials referred to were submitted to the examination of medical gentlemen of Nashville. The written communication from Mr. Lane was dated on the 26th of July, 1820, and stated that he had undertaken to make some further discoveries amongst the little tombs, which seemed to be peculiar to the settlement in which he lived, a few miles from Sparta. He found in one of the small graves, the package number 1, the fractured part of a skeleton. The grave, as usual, was about 2 feet in length, and 14 inches broad, okay? And 16 inches deep from the covering rock to the bottom, as nearly as could be ascertained, for the bottom of these graves is never covered with rock. The skull of this being, he said, was much larger than any he had before seen in these graves, but from the length of the thigh and arm bones may be conjectured the height. He also sent the teeth to the end that it might be decided whether they were canine, monkey, or human. The skull, though fractured, in his opinion, retained enough of its original form to determine to what class of beings it once belonged. All right, because they're so small, right? They're trying to see if this a monkey, is this like a dog, wolf, or something? What is this? They're trying to make sure. The body to which the skull belongs seemed not to have been interred in the usual form, but to have been set up in the grave with his back against the head rock of the tomb. The skull was found uppermost, and directly beneath it the ribs, but these were so decayed that they crumbled with the slightest touch, and could not be preserved. Next were the arms and thigh bones lying beside each other, with their upper ends near the head rock, and the skull directly on the upper end of these bones. Hence it is supposed the body was not prostrate. With this personage were found some other singularities, 3 vessels and 2 conchs, when one of each set is customary in these small graves. The size and figure of the furniture is noticeable, namely, a vessel that, from what of it remains, appears to have holden a quantity between 1 and 2 quarts, whilst the other graves have a vessel holden about 1 pint. This large vessel also being carved and laced, whilst the others have their vessels entirely plain, is in this respect singular. The basin, though otherwise plain, is laced round the rim. The other vessel is so broken down that no observations can be made on it. Further than this, that from the strength which seems attached to the bottom, it must have been intended for drudgery. These vessels were found in the following order: the large carved pot on the right, and the strong bottom vessel and 2 cones on the left. These things considered, the size of the head, the unusual largeness of the grave, the number, quantity, and size of the vessels, and the number of shells, they being muscle instead of conch shells, the vessels being placed on the right and left, and the body being set erect, all indicated a difference between the person to whom this skeleton belonged and ordinary ones. On Saturday, the 29th of July, 1820, Mr. Lane went to Captain Simon Doyle's, the place where Mr. Anderson formerly lived, to search there for further discoveries. He and those who were with him opened 2 small graves. The first, 18 inches long, okay? That was the size of this grave, okay? About 12 inches broad. It contained little bones, pieces of part of 1 tooth, and other things contained in package number 2. The second grave was 2 feet long, 13 inches wide, and 15 inches deep. It contained the bones, teeth, vessel, and shells enclosed in package number 3. This person was laid upon the right side, with his head to the south and his face to the east. The body lay north and south, and the thigh bones east and west. The legs were then laid back so as to form an angle, with the thighs of about 30 degrees. All this could be clearly ascertained by cautious and careful examination of the bones, which, although plainly to be seen, yet nevertheless were so decayed that they would crumble at the slightest touch. All right, these must be really, really old pygmy people. Nor could they possibly lift the bones in any sounder condition than as they were presented to view in the package. The underside of the skull, as it was in the grave, was sounder and stronger than that which was uppermost. The skull which was in the grave last opened could not possibly be raised, for the graves were all full of dirt, as closely bound together as any other ground outside the grave. And when the skull is discovered, the probability is that a hole will break into it on the upper part. The concave is perfectly hollow, but the earth could not be removed from about it without crumbling it down as fast as the earth was removed. The concave diameter, Mr. Lane measured, it was about 5 inches. Some small scraps of it, number 3, he sent. The socket of the eye was perceptible. The nettings of the head were visible. The chin, the size and strength of the teeth, and the size and curvature of the ribs were all apparent. The graves lie promiscuously through the farm of Mr. Lane. All right, guys, a lot of different graves here of these little people. But at Mr. Anderson's, where Captain Doyle now lives, there's a large and closely connected burying ground, all of the description already given. And there are others of the same description 4 miles south of Sparta, all right? All these graves of little people. Mr. Anderson formerly opened many of them. Captain Doyle, the present owner, has opened several of them, and they both say they believe hundreds might be found there. There is no discernible rising on the surface of the earth by reason of these graves, but they are found by striking an iron tool into the ground so deep as to strike the covering rock. This rock being then removed, the grave can be easily discovered by the edges of the side and end rocks. On Tuesday, the 1st of August, 1820, Mr. Lane and company, with his sons Jacob A. Lane, Esquire, made further searches in the burying ground at Captain Doyle's formerly Mr. Anderson's. They opened another small grave, just 22 inches long, another one, little guy, made after the usual form, and took out of it the bones and little trinkets in package number 4. This skeleton lay on its back, with its feet drawn up so as to raise the knees about 4 inches above the bottom of the grave. The head was raised above the bottom of the grave also, so as to cause the chin to lie on the breast. They measured the skeleton carefully as it lay in the grave and found it to be from a little below the ankle joints to the top of the skull, 2 feet 10 inches. All right, that was the size of this person. He was 2 feet 10 inches, a little guy. All right, taking care to measure the limbs as they mendered and making sufficient allowance for she reclining of the head at any rate. It was not above 3 feet high. Its head was to the east, the face to the west. This grave was 4 feet from the one last mentioned. The little round shelf found in this grave with 2 little holes, a cross and 2 circles, a cross and 2 circles cut in it, is what was not seen in any other grave they had opened. That is to say, the cross and circles were not. 3 vessels were in the grave, but all broken down so that they were not worth preserving. 5 feet from the grave, just opened, they opened another. It was large, constructed after the manner of a coffin, the head 14 inches broad, the elbows 22 inches, and the foot 10 inches. The sides and ends were lined with flag rock, after the manner of the small graves, but not quite so deep, it being only 12 inches. In the grave lay a person 5 feet 5 inches high, the head to the west and the feet to the east. They uncovered the bones of this skeleton from head to foot without moving any bone until they had a full view of the entire skeleton. It was not shrouded, for its mouth was extended wide open and was full of teeth. The arms lay along the sides, the ribs were broad and flat, and more than double the size of those of the Pygmies. The head was longer, the eyes much wider asunder, the forehead much higher above the eyebrows, and the underjaw measured just 1 inch longer at each side than the little one sent to Nashville. All right, so they found an actual person that was 5'5", but they're saying these were like double the size of the little guys. They laid them together and ascertained the exact difference. The collarbone, the arm, thigh, and leg bones of this being appeared strong, beyond what they expected from the size of human bones. The elbows, knee, and ankle joints were much larger than was expected. After they had measured it and satisfied themselves of its true position, they raised many of the bones, particularly the head, all the limbs, some few joints on the backbone, some ribs, and the broad flat bones at the bottom of the lower chest. The skull had not a fracture, except the top of the right cheek bone, which they undesignedly struck off. The limbs were all lying in their proper posture, with joint to its joint, and bone to its socket. When they raised the skull, a great number of hairs were found sticking to it, which seemed to be the hairs of the head of the person interred. They were fine and straight and of a bright silver gray. These bones they laid back in the grave, covered them with the former coverings, rocks, and then with earth. No vessels or trinkets were found with this skeleton, and from the great dissimilarity in the shape of their heads, the size and make of their ribs, the great disproportion between the size of the joints and the bones of their limbs, They seemed to belong to very different tribes of people. The heads of the Pygmies appeared larger upon inspection than they had supposed them to be, and upon finding the bones in package number 1, no person in the neighborhood who had formerly seen the little graves opened could believe that this was of the same kind, owing to its size, but in that they must have been mistaken, for the graves are the same in every particular, though when measured they seem to be a few inches longer in length and breadth than was at first imagined, for it had been 5 or 6 years since they had seen any of them, nor could they have yet believed otherwise, had they not searched out new ones and reduced them to actual measurement. They have attended to a circumstance now which before had not been thought of, namely, that the body, as laid in the grave with its limbs, particularly the legs and thighs, were laid crooked, so as to reduce the length, and being a person of 2 feet 10 inches high, or perhaps as high as 3 feet, into a grave of 2 feet long, but continues, Mr. Lane, from the great number of graves of this description and size, which we found here, and amongst them all, but one of a larger size. It seems to be intimated that there have been a race of people here in ancient times whose height was from 2 feet 10 inches to 3 feet. Okay, we're talking about in ancient America. They're finding this in Tennessee. This is what they're letting you know. They were trying to figure out why they're finding these little graves, what appears these little bones of 2 feet 10 inches. Maybe it's because the way they were arranged, but no, they're letting you know. It seems that there were in ancient times people here whose height was from 2 feet to 10 inches to 3 feet, and that they have addicted themselves to strong superstitions is indubitable. All right, that's undeniable. They're part of the myth. It's what he's saying. As ancient as the hair of the large skeleton seemed to be, there was not a tooth lost or unsound in the whole head. But the pygmy head in number 4 has in the upper jaw a decayed tooth, whence it is conjectured that the person to whom this skeleton belonged was elder than the other. Mr. Lane sent also for examination a small package, number 5. This contained 2 dozen small conch shells and 2 other small shells, like a taper screw. In the small package are the small pieces of old pots picked up above ground at the old town of Mr. Wilson's. It remained sound after lying above ground, perhaps for several hundred years. The small conch in this package were found about 4 miles southwesterly from Sparta, and about 8 miles west of Mr. Lane's farm, near where the large skeletons were found, of 7 feet in length or upwards, which have been already mentioned. They were there shown a little mound on the margin of one of their old towns, which was literally covered with them. They got a hoe and dug into it, and found that the shells lay mixed with the earth, about 4 feet deep, but none that they could find deeper. Amongst them were many of the taper shells, terebratula. They also found just below the surface some old, decayed bones, which they believed to be human, and some pieces of fire coal. A quantity of those a quantity of those shells to the amount of half a bushel might be gotten at this place. Package number 6 was also sent by Mr. Lane, in which is a small stone. This and many others of the same shape are found about the old towns. Some of them are of a bluish color, some green, some black. They are of different sizes, but all appear to be of the same species or quality of rock, of which it is said there are none such which are the natural production of the country. So this is coming from far away, the things they're finding buried with these people. These packages and their contents were submitted to the gentlemen of the medical faculty at Nashville, and they examined them. Various opinions were entertained upon the maturity or infancy of the small skeletons. The prevailing opinion seemed to be that these skeletons belonged to adult persons, okay? They weren't children. One gentleman agreed that one of the small skulls belonged to an adult, but thought that the size of the body could not be judged off from the cranium, but that the cylindrical bones in number 1 and the tooth belonged to some animal of the canine species. Another believed, so the fact seems now to be taken, that the bones and tooth in number 1 belonged to some carnivorous animal of the canine genus, but that the skull belonged to an adult person of small size, not much exceeding 3 feet in length. Another has given the same opinion upon inspection of the bones. All right, so they're all saying, hey, the bones, the skull is definitely an adult, 3 feet or under. The small conch shells, 2 dozen in number, might be accounted for by reference to the Hindu customs, were it not for the neighborhood of the large skeletons which forbid the idea of emigration from the south. They were found in a small mound on the margin of an old town, which mound was covered with them, and they were intermixed with the clay to the depth of 4 feet below the surface. One of them was placed in the water vessel of the capacity of a pint, which was placed at the head of each pygmy skeleton. Had they not been deemed very sacred, the inhabitants of the town would have gradually removed them from the mound, for at least they were curiosities, not being of the growth of the country, and having been brought from the ocean at least 500 or 600 miles, if they did not come from the northeastern shores of America. Yet they were left undisturbed so long as the people remained who placed them in the crust of the mound. Beneath them were human bones, perhaps of some distinguished priest of Vishnu. And perhaps, yeah, you guys hear that? And perhaps each grave in which was one of these skeletons contained the bones of a worshipper of Vishnu. In ancient times, the worshippers of the sun from the confines of China and Tibet emigrated to Sarmatia, and thence to Germany, and thence to Finland and the countries of the Samoyeds, which so much resembled the Eskimos. And these latter also were worshippers of the sun, as well as the Greenlanders. From the country of their primitive emigration, the Eskimos may have brought with them to America, through many other ages and people, this branch of the most ancient religion of India and of the East. No, okay, so this part we're gonna touch the Haja. We already know America's a true old world. We're talking about India, Hindustan. Who are the Nagas? We went over there. He's seen it in reverse. He's saying maybe the Eskimos brought all this over here. Maybe. No. With respect to those small conch shells found buried with the small skeletons, which conch are about the size of pullet eggs, we may conjecture with some degrees of certainty that these are relics of Hindu superstition, which came immediately or immediately from India, where it originated. But as it is admitted on all hands that these skeletons belong to human beings, though some bones and teeth of the canine species are intermixed, we shall be at a loss to conjecture where in times of antiquity lived this diminutive race of human beings. That such a race of men once existed, we're talking about pygmies, real pygmies here, guys, in America, is asserted by Homer and Herodotus, the most ancient profane writers that we know of, but the assertion has never received credit. They were mentioned also by Pliny, Strabo, and Mela as existing in India. This is India, guys, you get it? India superior the whole time. America, North America is India superior, as well as in Ethiopia. Well, this is the other Ethiopia, or where the Ethiopians, the Western Ethiopians dwell, where Herodotus states them to have been. Remember, he said there was the Western and Eastern Ethiopians slash Atlanteans. But Jovius says that they are found in the extremities of the northern regions, referring no doubt to the Samiotes of Lapland and those to the north of them. The best opinion advanced upon the subject seems to be that some of the northeastern inhabitants of America came in the train of the Scythians or Tartars. All right, so again, seen in reverse, they're trying to say, how did these little pygmies get here? Why do pygmies have to be from somewhere else? America's a true old world. Of the stones found about the old towns in White County, some of a bluish color, some greenish, and some black, and all, as it is supposed, foreign to the country, were found. It shall suffice to mention that a stone about 6 inches long, half an inch thick, 3 inches wide, and still widened to the edge, and having an edge like an axe, was found in an old fortification in White County, 5 or 6 miles from Sparta. It seemed tinged on the edge and sides with blood which had been petrified on a part of the axe. The color of green was intermixed with a few spots of lighter complexion. It is very hard and smooth. Stone axes of exactly the same description are brought from the Fiji or Friendly Islands in the Pacific by navigators. The same species of stone is found on the banks of the Amazon. From the former of which places came also the art of making the feathered mantles before spoken. All right, so all right, a connection here with the Amazon, High Brazil, and the Pacific Islanders. Remember what we were reading, guys? The Natural and Aboriginal History of Tennessee by John Haywood, 1823. So, what happened to these bones? Why did they never tell us about these findings? And as you guys can see here, this is what happened to these bones. We're going to read from the Smithsonian Contributions to Knowledge, Volume 22. So, you guys already know what the Smithsonian does. They like to hide everything. So, yeah, they got a hold of these findings, of course. And we're going to get a report coming out of this journal. It's called Explorations of the Aboriginal Remains of Tennessee by Joseph Jones, MD, Professor of Chemistry and Clinical Medicine in the Medical Department of the University of Louisiana, New Orleans. This is from 1876, when Kentucky was first explored. Great numbers of human bodies are said to have been found in a state of preservation in a cave near Lexington. As the pioneers did not appear to attach much importance to the antiquities, these bodies were not preserved. The bodies found in the Saltpetre Cave of Kentucky are said to have been considerably smaller than the men of our times. All right, they found little people here, smaller than the men of our times and regular humans of the author's time. And their teeth are described as long, white, and sharp, with sharp teeth and separated by considerable intervals. Continuing a little further, it says in some localities, the sides of the tombs stood up above the surface from 4 to 8 inches, as in the case of the stone graves described by Bartram. When a number of coffins were placed together, the side stones of the first frequently constituted the side of the second, and so on. Many of the stone graves, listen to this, guys, are quite small and capable of containing only the body of a newborn infant. These small graves were constructed with great care, and the sides, bottom, and top were formed of much thinner and smoother slabs than the graves of the adults. Many of the short, square graves, not more than 18 inches or 2 feet in length, contain the bones of adults piled together, the crania being surrounded by or resting upon the arm and leg bones. This class of graves containing the bones of adults packed in small space were probably constructed at the general burying festival, or contained the remains of the dead which had been transported from a distance. This view is sustained by the fact that in some of these graves I have found portions of 2 or more skeletons, sometimes 2 crania, and in others only a portion of a single skeleton. Now listen to this, guys. This is the Smithsonian, right? Report. It has been frequently asserted that the smaller graves contain the bones of small adults or pygmies. It has been further asserted that the entire cemeteries were composed of these small graves, okay? The entire cemetery, all these burying grounds, all this extensive burial grounds are full of pygmies, guys. Pygmies, people that are less than 3 feet tall, 2 feet 10 inches. Pygmies. They're finding here in Tennessee numerous, numerous. Here they go on to quote the book we just read from. He says here in a note added to this description, Haywood record the fact that in the neighborhood of St. Louis, Missouri, small stone graves exist, as in Tennessee, and that in certain ancient mounds near Lake Erie, skeletons of people of small stature are found as well, all right? And that's on his page 360, 361 that we just came from.
A pygmy graveyard in Tennessee, 1876. 6 acres in the graveyard, buried sitting or standing. A dwarf race of people, about 3 feet high, estimated 75,000 to 100,000 buried there. Again, you hear this, guys? What pygmy people who are 3 to 4 feet high? How many are buried there? 75 to 100,000. This things they never told us. Let's read this report. It says, an ancient graveyard of vast proportions hath been found in Coffee County. It is similar to those found in White County and other places in Tennessee, but it is vastly more extensive and shows that the race of pygmies who once inhabited this country were very numerous. All right? The same peculiarities of position observed in the White County graves are found in these. The writer of the letter says, some considerable excitement and curiosity took place a few days since near Hillsborough, Coffee County, or James Brown's farm. A man was plowing in a field which has been cultivated many years, plowing up a man's skull and other bones. After making a further examination, they found that there were about 6 acres in the graveyard. They were buried in a sitting or standing position. Their bones show that they were a dwarf race of people, about 3 feet high. It is estimated that there were about 75,000 to 100,000 buried there, all right? Pygmies and Tennessee. Pygmies are not just from Africa or the Bushmen from Africa. You gotta dodge the hijack. But great report here, as you guys can see, this was reported in a newspaper, 1876.
All right, and for the dismount right here, we go straight to the New York Times time machine. We're going to read an article from Friday, March 24th, 1876. It says here, Tennessee Pygmies. Prehistoric America must have been an exceedingly curious and interesting country. Its forests were filled with mastodons, megatheriums, and other large, lively beasts, any one of which thought nothing of scratching himself on the sharp pinnacles of convenient Gothic church, and so toppling it over on its scores of helpless new pew holders. In the Mississippi Valley, the industrious mound builders were constantly throwing up gigantic molehills and planting them with earthen pots and copper hatchets in the vain expectation that the seed thus sown would yield enormous crops of kitchenware and carpenter's tools. In Kentucky, the giants to whom the bones recently discovered, all right, giant bones in a Kentucky cave, are said to have strode loftily along the turnpikes, kicking the Indians and the mound builders contemptuously out of the way. And finally, in Tennessee, a race of Pygmies was continually holding political meetings and resolving that mastodons, mound builders, and giants should be promptly abolished, and that the size of the inhabitants of this country should be made and kept commensurate with its commercial necessities. It is rather odd that the existence of the Tennessee Pygmies of prehistoric America was until recently never suspected. Right? The New York Times, guys, is telling you, hey, man, how come you guys didn't know about this? The name of the mastodon has long been familiar to every person who is in the least degree addicted to fossils. His remains in the shape of a plaster of Paris skeleton with the artist's name stamped in forehead are exhibited in every respectable museum, and inspired the youth of America with bitter regret that the animal so beautifully adapted for experiments with red pepper lozenges has gone where the small boy ceases to trouble and the nomadic circus is at rest. The mound builders have been the subject of scores of learned essays in which their identity with the Aztecs, the Chinese, the Egyptians, the Welsh, and the lost tribes of Israel has been triumphantly shown. All right, it has been what? It has been triumphantly shown, it has been proven, and of the exact height and probable capacity for whiskey of the Kentucky Giants, we have had careful and presumably accurate statistics. The discovery of the Pygmies is, however, so very recent that no one has as yet framed any theory whatever to account for their origin and to explain their complete extinction. When the Kentucky Giants were discovered, it was natural that the state pride of the people of Tennessee should be somewhat hurt. The Tennesseans, however, did not sit down and content themselves with reviling the Kentuckians and insinuating doubts as to the alleged character of the gigantic bones. They promptly proceeded to find rival bones of still greater merit, and their industry has been rewarded by their discovery of a graveyard containing the skeletons of 75,000 Pygmies of the average height of 3 feet each. What are the 3 8-foot giants of Kentucky in comparison with so great a cloud of Pygmies? If we may judge from the price usually paid by circus managers for living giants and dwarfs, a 3-foot dwarf is decidedly more valuable than an 8-foot giant. And if the same standard governs the price of fossils, the 75,000 Tennessee Pygmies are worth fully 25,000 times as much as the 3 Kentucky giants. While the Kentuckians can present their giant to 3 eminent scientific men and thus obtain 3 distinct scientific reports certifying to the enormous interest and value of the fossil giants, the Tennesseans can supply every scientific
man in this country and in Europe with a fossil dwarf, and so secure testimonials without number to the unequaled excellence of Tennessee pygmies. Indeed, if the discoverers of the pygmies will only employ some astute piano maker who is an expert in testimonials to obtain for the fossil dwarfs the recognition of the scientific world, there is not a living scientific person who will not sign a certificate setting forth his admiration for the beauty and durability of the pygmies, and his determination to use none but those of the celebrated Tennessee graveyard for the rest of his professional life. At what period these pygmies flourished, what they accomplished, and by what means they were induced to retire simultaneously to their graveyard can only be conjectured. They may have been the identical pygmies that, according to the Greek legend, waged war with the Cranes. Alright guys, it might be the ones from the Greek legends. If so, the Cranes must have proved too powerful for them. This is hardly probable, and any modern Tennessean who has attempted to keep chickens in the neighborhood of a family of citizens of African descent, dodged the hijack, will scornfully refuse to believe that pygmies of 3 feet in height could not kill cranes on their roosts with at least as much success as is achieved by the African small boy when invading the midnight hen house. All right, I don't know where they're going with this, but let's touch the hijack. We must wait for further discoveries before it will be safe to decide whether the pygmies were contemporary with the giants and whether they preceded the mound builders. The bare fact that they once existed is all that we can now safely affirm of them. They did exist, but doubtless by the time that every home in the country is ornamented by a fossil pygmy and every newspaper publishes extracts from the certificates of scientific persons who are overwhelmed with admiration of the vast superiority of the Tennessee to those of all rival communities, we shall be in the possession of information which will enable us to know at least as much of the pygmies as we now know of the mastodon and the mound builders. All right, there were so many graves, many people were talking about these guys, yet this was never publicized. This never reached your textbooks. This doesn't fit the historical narratives or their theories of evolution. The Smithsonian got involved, and one guy tried to debunk it, say it was all children, and that's what they went with. But this is just one example of the legends and stories and the history of the little people around the world. And we are going to continue reading about more cases. We know America's a true old world, and why wouldn't it have people of different stature here in the oldest land out of the primordial waters? Hope you guys enjoyed the readings today. A lot of interesting stuff here. We know we're talking about giants and pygmies. This is usually left in the realm of conspiracy, but as you guys can see, this was written about in anthropological books and newspaper reports. This may be more than just myth. So thanks for tuning in once again. Much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. Awa.